guess good afternoon in some parts of the country. Here we are, number 6, habitual fitness. And that word fitness is still not quite totally resonating with me, but it gets the point across as something to work at and to improve one's capabilities in. So moving through all of the factors so far, the pattern I've noticed is some have a very finite focus, which means that what we're talking about has a laser-like, a scope-like focus of task-oriented activity and insights, i.e., if we're talking about nutrition, you know that we're likely going to be focusing on food. We're talking about fitness, it's going to be focusing on exercise. Habit's a little bit different. To me, habit was more along the lines of emotional fitness, where you're talking about some bigger picture concepts, but I think an emotion is still a finite thing that has its defined boundaries within the context of conversation, always giving room to, use a metaphor or an analogy to liken that emotion to something happening in life or something to do with life. Habit is a little bit different. And going into this one, I even thought, how can I make this something to where people aren't just hearing the obvious? Engage in good habits, don't engage in bad habits. The end. Good night. But the reality of the situation is looking at the concept of what a habit is, how it's an actual pathway within our neurologically, controlled loops in neurochemistry, but it underpins everything. Yeah, I kind of thought back to, my own client experiences or anything that I've done in my life that has required the effort to put in to derive the successive outcome. And I realized the import of the nature of habit and how maybe we as clinicians don't talk about habits enough to be mindful to bring it into the conversation when we're talking to someone, but also to be thinking about it in terms of an analysis of that person or that client while we're talking to them, coaching them. Because at the end of the day, we all want to help people get better. So, without further ado, I think we should dive into the nature of what a habit is. And I got to give Mr. Jeff Thurston props for this one. This came from his a download of his one day that ended up in my Telegram inbox, and I don't mean to download from the internet, although it is. This kind of crossed his desk, and he thought, hey, why not use this to set the tone for this lecture? So the concept that people do not decide their futures, they decide their habits, and their habits ultimately decide their futures, which is absolutely true. And bringing awareness to one's habits is the first opportunity that eventually yields the realization in someone's consciousness that they're tired of feeling like crap. They want to do something about it. They know they have to do something about it. They may not know where to start, but they may have an end goal in mind. So keep this thought in your mind as we go through this, but also take this with you as you're thinking about each of your clients. The original concept of a habit isn't actually all that old. It's a byproduct of 19th century psychology, which was originally described as a habit, or rather a habit is a routine, a behavior, excuse me, or in an even cognitive process that starts spontaneously, but is repeated automatically as a result of prior experience. So it's a very long way of saying that really is the concept of conditioning, behavioral conditioning. And I use this one a lot in the concept of how the body works. Neurons that fire together wire together. So if you've ever, had a hard time trying to relate to a client as to why relaxing is a good idea, but the concept of being able to relax to them is a foreign concept, is because their habitual existence has been that they need to set the room on fire so they can take a breath out fully and relax. So a lot of habit, not only is it wired into our day-to-day behaviors, I also believe it's wired into our neurochemistry. It's wired into our nervous systems. And part of unraveling a habit is unraveling the physical, the mental, and the emotional aspects of what underpin that habit. So it gives us the opportunity to tap into neuroplasticity. Habits are wonderful things. I don't want to make them sound like they're bad things, because the better your habits, ultimately the better your life. The reason a habit exists is because, well, fundamentally, it's all about efficiency. If you didn't have to think about absolutely everything you did, i.e., making coffee in the morning, which you may do every single morning, if you had to think about that like it was the first time you ever learned how to make a pour over, it would be a very time and energy consuming process. We have to understand that the body's innate desire is to make things easy and efficient. So if we can reduce the decision-making burden on a regular basis of the things that we habitually do, we free up more energy for goal-oriented behavior. And we'll talk about a little bit more of a nuanced analysis of a habit upcoming. But fundamentally, it's a behavior that initially comes from a conscious effort, and there's loops in terms of what ingrains them. So there's a cue. A cue is the thing that kind of perks our awareness to something. A routine, the established process of doing said thing, and the reward is the thing that seals in the habit. So if we understand how a habit comes together and forms the loop, we can understand how it can become theoretically unwired. And the body is so interesting. It never ceases to amaze me, all the things that the body can do in the nature of survival and self-preservation. In order to keep habits from interfering with, current needs and plans, the body and the brain specifically has actually coordinated these different loops in order to separate habitual behavior from goal-based behavior. And an example of this would be, if I have made the conscious decision to go drive and visit my mom, that is something that is not a habit unless I do it every Sunday. But if I just out of the blue want to go visit my mom, I know that I'm wanting to drive there. I need to get there from point A to point B in my car. But habitually, if I've wired it into myself that every time I come to a red light, I scroll through Instagram, through TikTok or whatever, and I do that 7 times on the way to my mom's house, but I have not one moment of conscious awareness that I'm doing it, that habit is a separate thing from the conscious behavior that I originally wanted to set forth. I think this example, even though very abstract, has a lot of merit when you look at why specific clients engage in certain habits. It may be out of entirely habitual behavior that in the middle of the day they walk to the lunchroom and someone's got cookies on the countertop and they grab one. They don't even think about it. Or they're getting tired and immediately they reach for something sugary, they reach for coffee. It's 3 p.m. in the afternoon. They know it's going to compromise their sleep quality, but they don't even think that they're doing it. You need to bring awareness to these things to understand the difference between habitual behavior that is detrimental and goal-based behavior that is actually positive. The thing with habits is they're context dependent, right? So they become strengthened through repetition. And a lot of it from the surrounding environment really becomes dependent on the relevant cues. When I was doing my research for this, I came across a story of a young girl playing soccer, and she had decided to give up eating junk food for, I think it was the Jewish high holidays. And she was in the midst of her soccer practice, and all of a sudden she found herself in the middle of a conversation eating some donuts or some cookies or something, and she was mortified that she didn't even realize that she had done it. And it was the initiation point for explaining this whole process of differentiating between the conscious awareness of goal-oriented behavior and the lack of awareness of a habit. So it's like trying to educate your clients to be more mindful of what it is they're doing. If every time someone walks into the kitchen, they automatically look in the pantry, you're more likely to eat something than if you didn't look at the pantry at all. But the foundational behavior of what initiated that bad habit, the context and the cue, if you will, is if every time you go to the grocery store, you buy snack food and you keep said snack food in the pantry, well, then you're likely setting yourself up for failure, because if there's no fruits, vegetables, healthy snacks in the pantry, just junk food, it's almost a foregone conclusion, if you don't have good willpower, what the ultimate action and outcome is going to be. And the thing about habits is they do not require much cognitive input. They perform very quickly. In many ways, they're almost reflexive, but they also tend to be relatively inflexible. You either do it or you don't. And in some cases, you only are aware of a habit when it's being taken away from you. Think of someone who's trying to quit smoking, and the first few days of every time they want to have a cigarette, they're reminded that they made the decision to quit. They're only reminded of the lack of flexibility that habit has developed in them when they really want something. The positive aspect of modifying a habit moves it towards what's called goal-directed behavior. So this is performed based upon the context of expectation, an outcome that is hopefully predictable, which allows for adaptation or changes. So I look at these two things as one is automated programming, the other is conscious behavior. And with conscious behavior, we know that there's not necessarily one way to get there. An example might be starting an exercise routine. In 6 months, you might have the goal to run a marathon. You don't know exactly what every workout is going to look like, what every workout is going to feel like along the way. But if you methodically approach it, you're going to have the preparation, the consistency, and ultimately the execution to prepare your body to run that marathon, because it's a conscious endeavor. If you can make your exercise routine an automated thing in the sense that you never skip it, that's another helpful thing, because it's going to stop taking energy away from you, always overpowering your own will or potentially desires. So talking about how the brain coordinates these things, I can't not look at the biochemistry, because the more I get to learn about the human body, the more I feel like I'm useful to explain these things to not only clients, but other people. And I just have a general desire to want to know as much as possible. So the context of the shifting, the going back and forth between these two conserved aspects of how our brain creates these loops is really nothing more than a mix of neurochemistry, i.e., a sequencing of events of neurotransmitters that are firing based upon what we're doing. So on the left-hand side, we have what's called the sensor motor complex. And if anyone knows their functional neurology, sensor motor is really about sensory input information and output, and motor is motion. So if you look at where in the brain that habits are conserved, they're in the area that has to do with the body's regulating of its own motion in space and time. Think about that for a second. What does that tell you? Or at least what may you gain from an insight there? What I get is the body knows that it's going to put that part of the brain on high alert to be in charge, because a habit is so automated and subconscious that the body's greatest challenge is making sure that your movement is appropriate, because it doesn't have to give any thought to a habit. The frontal cortex or the prefrontal cortex, that's where executive function is. That's where higher thinking, intelligent approaches to cognitive challenges, emotional challenges, problem solving. That's the loop where the goal directed behavior works. Why? Because it requires you to be present. It requires you to have a lot of conscious thought, which is why, accomplishing goals is not an easy thing. It's not a guaranteed thing, because they require you to show up and work. So I look at how the body partitions these requirements. It gives the thing that doesn't have the goal of conscious thought and execution and presence the task of dealing with mastering a habit loop. And it gives the area of the brain that is one of the most energy hungry parts of the brains the job with trying to figure out how to change habits and execute conscious behaviors. So I found that to be a really interesting thing. And think about this: if this is a brain-directed thing, or at least it's organized and executed by the brain, someone's health has connection to this consideration. If we have an inflamed brain, we don't have a brain that performs appropriately. We don't have a brain that signals properly. If we have nutritional deficiencies and we require cofactors to make peptide hormones, to make neurotransmitters, to have the right cofactors to conduct the biochemical reactions that make these things, we're deficient in vitamins and minerals, essential fats, things of that nature, well, then the brain's not going to be operating or even form properly. And we've spoken about the nervous system over the last 6 months so intently. We know that what goes on in the gut affects the brain. So if we have a client with some kind of dysbiosis, bacterial overgrowth, infection, what have you, there's a gut-brain issue. This process that we're assuming works 100% efficiently all the time is not going to be the case if a client's dealing with something that is inflammatory or neurological or even immune stimulating in nature. So understand that it may be a really important consideration for you to understand your clients, and that their reticence to making a change might not solely be personality or emotionally based. There may be a physiologic source of origin as to why their brains cannot conceptualize making the change without the emotional volatility that usually comes from people who don't want to make a change. So the real goal in daily life is this fluidity between habit and goal, habit and goal. And ideally, we can allow for change to be plasticity based. Neuroplasticity is an important thing, because it is very possible to change the way you think, change the way you feel, change the way you behave, ultimately change the way you live. So these are 5 questions that I thought to, what is an approach to switching a habit into a healthy behavior? Is like, what do we value? What's the driver? Typically, humans move away from pain and move towards pleasure, unless you're a serial masochist or someone who's absolutely obsessed with self-development and upgrading yourselves. But what we value, what we determine to be symbolically important, is usually the driver in any goal-based behavior. If someone doesn't value health, but they're telling you that they want to improve their health, there's a big incoherence or an inconsistency there in terms of what's actually important and where the motivation is going to come from. Second thing is, how much awareness do we carry in a day? If you actually sit there and think about how much of your day you remember. Someone's like, oh, what did you do after lunch today? And you go, I don't remember. mean, your body was there, but your mind maybe not. And that awareness is really an absolutely necessary tool to be able to observe yourself in the initiations of potentially engaging in the behaviors that underpin bad habits. The other aspect we've talked about before is when we perform our tasks, how mindful are we? Are we singularly focused? And, I don't want to call anyone out in an inappropriate way, but, I can't ever see anyone on the other side of these lectures. So if someone's watching this after the fact on YouTube, are you on your phone simultaneously? Are you cooking dinner and this is on, in the background? And then you have to hear the sound of my voice as you're preparing dinner for your family. I don't know, that's a good thing. But ultimately, when we are more mindful in what we do, we become more present, we become more able to be subtle in our switches, we become much more able to commit short-term memory to long-term memory, and new habits require a lot of mindfulness. How often do we examine how we spend our time? Are we rigorous in, not self-judgment, but self-accountability? Do we often review how our life may not be going the direction we want it to, but we're not necessarily being accountable to how we're conducting ourselves or spending our time? And the last part is, I think this is a huge one. How often do we allow ourselves to evolve and upgrade? Change is a terrifying thing for most people, especially if someone likes consistency and predictability in their lives. When you change, you leave a lot open to change that is greater than you. What I mean by that is, if all of your friends and the people that you know are similar in their behaviors and relationships to things in life like health, when you start to change, you may face backlash from people who are now becoming more aware of their own bad habits, but rather than be encouraging to you, they want to discourage you from not moving away from them so it doesn't make them feel worse. Or if you do change and you lose all the people that you're connected to, and all of a sudden you feel a greater sense of loneliness and a lack of connection, that sometimes is enough to push someone away from wanting to do that, because being ostracized from the tribe is one of the original human fears. But these are very real questions that I think are worth asking, not only ourselves but especially our clients, when they come into your office and they ask you to help them. Like, I can help you, but are you ready? Are you really willing to do what this takes? And that may be the difference from allowing someone to be, just another allowing you to be just another stop on this client's, Rolodex of trying to help themselves through different professionals. Or maybe you're the person who finally gets through to them and helps them change their life. I don't know. But there's also a downside to this. I mean, for every yin, there is the appropriate yang, and there is the concept of psychopathology as it relates to this habitual behavior conundrum. And when I say psychopathology, I don't mean like a serial killer psychopath. In the way we say a pathological disease, there is a faulty pattern that predisposes one to illness. And in many cases, one can have psychopathology conserved in their thought processes that lead to the generation of habits and behaviors. One of the biggest things that causes someone to go into a little bit of a psychopath-like state is acute and chronic stress. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Stress makes us go to more of a survival instinct, more like a lizard brain, if you will. And research on both humans and animals has shown that when people are stressed, they increase their reliance upon subjective behavior. And it's one reason that I want to make sure that I gather a really good intake session and accompanied with some objective data on how the person's nervous system is working in some way, shape, or form. Because if someone's in high stress and they don't necessarily know, and that is their normal, in order for the body to fully relax, we have to unwind the default settings of stress. And that may be why you may be doing everything right when it comes to food supplementation, exercise, lifestyle habits in terms of encouragement, but their body isn't able to give you that concurrent shift or improvement because its conserved mechanism is sympathetic dominance, which is predisposing them to be in catabolic states with high quantities of inflammation just to get by. So it's understanding how these things manifest in the context of like negative association relationships. When you get, illogically emotional surrounding the topic of changing your condition. I was just in Austin, Texas recently, and I was listening to a story about someone going to see a health professional, and the person said, wait, if you help me with this, it means you take away my medication. And guy's like, well, yeah. It's like, but then I don't know who I am. And it was just, I mean, I can't believe I heard that story, and I believe it was real, or else why would someone say it? But think about that. If you take away someone's association with an identity because of illness, that person may actually not want to get there. So it's also figuring out how to work in conjunction with potentially other professionals or a different side of that person if they do have harmful emotions that drive specific behaviors or OCD style tendencies. Because all of this stuff came out of the concept of asking what is a habit, and you realize what underpins people's habits really does underpin their personalities. So the key takeaway here is if you can find a way to wire your oriented goals or desires into converted habitual behaviors, this is what allows you to make the big moves in life. This is what allows you to accomplish your tasks. And, it makes you ask, what does your day typically look like? Do you not shift your breakfast habits and strategies because rather than getting up 15 minutes earlier and making breakfast for yourself, you're just going to snooze that alarm clock once or twice and then rush to Starbucks on the way to work when you know you're not going to buy something good for you? Rather than sitting down and starting to read that book that you've been telling yourself you're going to do for the last 2 months, do you sit down, grab your phone first, start scrolling through TikTok, and then realize 30 minutes has gone by? Do you say yes to going out for a few drinks, going out for dinner with your friends, and then all of a sudden it's 2 in the morning and you know that you're not going to make the workout class at 9 a.m. tomorrow? All of these things are habits of understanding that where people allocate their weight of importance, how they've ingrained habitual behaviors, oftentimes can be their biggest roadblocks to their processes and paths of healing. So think about these things if you don't already do so when it comes to having conversations with your clients, not only in the initial intake, but along the way to make sure that you're not having to deal with an aspect of unaccountability that may actually be negatively impacting what this client wants to deal with. I thought this would be a kind of a fun exercise because I'm a big car guy, and I thought bringing in a personal example of this to show you how it can actually be something that's not only associated around negative behavior, but even the concept of self-mastery. I don't know if anyone here has ever driven a race car. If you have, awesome, we're instant friends. But believe it or not, once you start to engage in any sport that requires an intense amount of focus, as you get better at that sport, what once made it challenging to execute becomes habitually easier and easier. So it separates great athletes from good athletes and good athletes from non-athletes. So there are certain things where as you become more able and gifted in a sport, you also have the propensity to develop bad habits. And this example on the left is how you're supposed to take a corner when you're making a right turn. You're coming into the corner, you start your braking, you come off the brakes, there's a moment to where you turn in, and there's a moment to where you get back on the gas. So the important concept in driving fast is the more straight you can make any corner, the faster you can go. The faster you go, the less you slow down. You typically drive around the track faster than your opponents. That's all well and good. If you look at the graph on the right, it shows you just the subtle different inputs within a 10-meter space of a pro who's in the red and a student who's in the blue, nets 0.2 seconds of time increased over the course of 10 meters. You may be thinking, well, what's 0.2 seconds? It's not a big deal. Well, if every 10 meters that person gathered 0.2 seconds, and the track is only 100 meters, it's 2 seconds in 100 meters. That's an absolute lifetime. So habits aren't only about making sure that you move from negative behaviors to positive behaviors. Once you've gotten into the process of good habits, I believe they constantly need to be reevaluated and potentially rearranged if your goals and desires are to excel at any specific level. And when in doubt, if that example doesn't resonate, why not go to a very cliche but powerful quote? Gandhi said, your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits, underline that one, your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny. I mean, we've been saying the same thing. Fundamentally, what one derives importance symbolically to is where they ultimately end up in life. And asking someone what's important to you and where do you want to go, I think it's a really profound question. So if you did read the actual chapter from the Thyroid Debacle, there were a ton of great practical aspects that you don't need to be a psychologist in order to give to your clients or even to yourself. And one of them is the self-assessment of your own habits. And I do believe that taking an honest look at your reality with, and this is a hard part to do, is with objective eyes will ultimately allow you to see what you need to change. This is really easy to do with someone else, especially if you do it for a living. Doing it with yourself can be highly, highly uncomfortable, but I encourage it nonetheless, because if you change your habits for the better, that is only going to extend to the positive benefits of the people that are around you and in your world. So asking yourself, how did your habits form? Where do they come from? Most of these come from our formative years, from our families, from our friends, our parents, things that we're taught at a young age. A lot of people don't realize that when humans are around the age of 7 or under, your brain waves are in a dominantly theta state. And if you look at what theta represents, theta is the closest brain wave that connects to the concept of hypnosis. So children don't see the world around them as we adults do. Children imbibe the world around them. And that's when a lot of these unconscious thought patterns and, you know, cultural memes and gender-based things that we may conserve inside of us, both good and not so good, when they're formed. And breaking those are not necessarily easy because we have to identify them first and we have to understand how they're provoked in our life. The second thing is, what holds us back from the adoption of a new habit or a better habit? And oftentimes self-sabotage, the lack of belief in self, the lack of support system, or just the general fear of change is a massive thing. Because if we don't allow ourselves to change, if we fear that, we're never going to make any change. And if we've decided that we want to, but we can't connect the dots to doing so, that can be a very painful thing. And I think a lot of habits come from a place of pain. Do we use our habits to mask something artificially? Is it filling a void? Is it a perpetual distraction? Is it something that's essentially preventing us from addressing what it is we know we need to address, but we might not be ready or we might not feel that we're prepared to do so? So self-assessment of habits is absolutely essential as a foundational thing. And, if we look at averages, this does not represent everyone, but we need to establish some sort of foundational principles. The average American spends 2.5 hours a day on social media. They spend 3.2 hours a day TV and Netflix. Now, I don't know if these are separate or if they're amalgamated, but let's say they're two separate ideas. If we have an 8-hour workday, then we've spent pretty much just under 6 of it scrolling through perpetual distraction, which unfortunately is designed to play upon our addictive pathways. It's that dopamine hit and that dopamine chase. We're looking at other aspects that potentially are habits taking away from our health. We eat 4 to 5 meals out per week. So that's 4 to 5 times you don't get to say what is in your food specifically or how it's prepared or where it's been sourced from. We spend 2 hours per day doing leisure activities and leisure activities outside TV and other things. And the average amount of time spent being active, and this is really unfortunate, is 14 to 24 minutes a day. Women are about 14 minutes a day in the US, men are about 24. And it didn't say what active was. It could be specifically just walking. So if we look at the vast majority of society, and these are the conserved habits, well, is it any wonder why we see so many people who are in need of overhauling their health and specifically their lives in that specific regard? And if you look at all of the stuff out there, I've read a lot of these books. Napoleon Hill, Outwitting the Devil, was a book that changed my mind. I've been fortunate to watch Les Brown speak. I thank Louise Hay for absolutely ablating my resistance to how thoughts and emotions affect physical health. But there's a common theme with all of this stuff. The masters of mindfulness, the awareness, the practices of success. If you look at what they're saying, they may be using different words. They may have their specific viewpoints on word choice, but fundamentally, it's really about self-accountability, being clear and directional with your thoughts, with your intentions, and ultimately about seeing the process through, knowing that success will come to those who are persistent and committed. And if you want it to be something that comes quickly, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way in this world. So how do we start? Well, I think first and foremost, you have to make a bond with yourself. The concept of, manifestation, if you want to use that word, is the alignment and process of thoughts, emotions, intentions, and actions. So you might want to accomplish a goal, but if you leave it very ambiguous and if you don't actually define it well, it's hard to make it real for yourself because you don't necessarily make that bond with yourself to be habitual in your behaviors and habits in order to continuously work towards that goal. And when it comes to health, it's really about nailing the fundamental basics. We have this thing called the circadian rhythm. And if we want to align our habits with our health, one of the best things that I always try to educate is the adherence to how our bodies perform throughout the day and when and where to place those tasks in order to get the maximum return on them, but also the greatest chance of likely success. So if we want to potentially increase our performance, when we're exercising matters depending on the kind of exercise we're doing. If we want to improve our overall vitality and start to, I don't know, reduce inflammation and potentially lose body fat, then making sure that we wake up with the sun in the morning and block, excessive artificial blue light in the evening so we can maximize melatonin secretion and regulate our cortisol rhythm and allow our metabolic processes to work optimally. Knowing these things is a really great starting point when it comes to aligning the concept of habit with health. And then there's daily routines and personal life and trying to figure out how to stay on track. Because there's two sayings I like. The first one is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The second one is short-term motivation leads to failure. So the question becomes, how do you maintain accountability with yourself? Is it through regular review? Is it with having a support system, doing this with someone else? Second thing is, how do you make it realistic in its implementation? I remember when I was working in the fitness industry, I used to do these fitness assessments and people would come in, they're like, oh, I have a wedding to go to in 8 weeks and I want to lose 40 pounds. And you just stop for a moment and go, how do I feel this without offending someone? Secondly, you realize that making something realistic is really not a strong suit for a lot of people because they have no idea how their body works. So being honest and realistic about the idea in itself is the most important thing. And the last thing I took from the executions of making this very implementable is making it a non-negotiable deal. And the suggestion that I liked in the book that I've actually had a young client of mine do was perform a 3-day self-assessment on current habits to see how they align with your goals. And it's a really honest practice because you really have to sit down and take pen to paper and get very clear with how you spend your time. And whatever comes out of that is what comes. But what the fun part is if there's opportunity there because a lot of your behaviors and habits don't align with the ultimate goal, well, then you can create strategy. At least I look at that as fun because for me, growth is a positive thing. And this ties back into the concept of habit because to know it is to understand how it came together. But I believe you have to know it in order to disassociate or disassemble it. And I won't go too in depth with the next little area because everyone's going to get the slides and I don't need to spend time reading off of the page, but this shows you kind of how a habit is formed. And, being a generalist in the context of a habit is a positive thing. If you can understand that fundamentally, the routine is the thing that ingrains it, the cue is what triggers the behavior, and the reward is the component that satisfies you, you'll understand why everyone reaches for coffee first thing in the morning. So if you understand what brings a habit together, you have to understand how to unfold or unravel a specific habit is probably a better word. And when it comes to the concept of changing an old habit, making the smallest evolution-based change to normal behavior is the best place to start. If someone, perpetually eats out and you tell them, well, I want you to make organic, paleo-friendly food at home 3 times a week, they're just going to throw everything up in the air and go, screw it, I'm just going to go out again. Why? Because the culture of what you've asked them to change is so dramatic. It's on the opposite side of the spectrum. So to maintain balance, that rebound effect has to happen. So understanding that the smallest amount of unaccustomed activity is where most people are ready to start. And if someone's never taken supplements before and they all of a sudden have an 8-bottle supplement protocol, that's probably going to overwhelm them. And you're going to realize those bottles are going to stay in their cabinet for the next 3 months. They just won't tell you. The second thing is identifying your kryptonite. What is an aspect of where your conditioning is stronger than the importance to change? those things are essential to avoid. So if you want to eat healthier, and someone plays baseball in the summer, and after baseball you go to the bar and have wings and beer with the guys, you have to identify your kryptonite there, and that's a philosophical debate. But what's really important to you? The other thing is making the initial reward enticing. How do you create a positive association with a new pattern? And one cool exercise with someone that you can do is have them walk through what it would feel like to experience this new positive thing. Have them live the experience ahead of time to show themselves what's actually there attached to it. Because if you can actually grab onto the emotion and the feeling as a result of that new reward, it shows you what I believe the authentic self is really in alignment with. And the last part, which is, not the most fun part, but it's the most honorable part, is repeating the pattern. The more you can double down on the reinforcement part of the habit, the more you can change that from behavior, which is not habitual yet, to habit. And subconscious reminders are super important. Programming this subtle reminder in your phone that after a while, you might know it goes off. You might not read it with intent, but just the simple fact that your brain is going to see those words in a subconscious reminder, it's going to ingrain itself into your neurology and hopefully become a new part of your life. And I left this up here as an example of, creating a good habit and breaking a bad habit, if anyone actually wants to examine these things in any further depth for the benefit of themselves and their clients. And then once we've been engaged in these behaviors for quite some time, how do we ensure that we're progressing ongoingly? Well, there's the concept of the book introduced called review, prune, and replace. So I look at it as better ways for, building in the maintenance of consistency and accountability. And it's more like giving yourself a scorecard. It's a debrief. Have you been able to maintain the shift in actions? Yes or no? Or as a percentage? Yes. Are you able to evolve that behavior? Are you ready to do so? Or are you still stuck on the thing that you're stuck in that pattern, that loop cycle with? Have you converted behavior into habit, or have you fallen off the wagon and do you have to start again? And I remember when I was talking to an old mentor of mine, and we're talking about, the process of learning and how to apply perceptive thought and theoretical stuff to a clinical aspect. He said this metaphor to me: so for flowers to bloom and thrive, every good gardener knows we need to prune, and that can be as a result of evolving from what you thought into another layer of truth, or giving up something that you become comfortable with because it's a limiting factor for your belief. So I think making time for a daily assessment, especially in the beginning of the process when motivation is high, but you're still closest to those negative behaviors, is absolutely essential. So that in and of itself is looking at, I think, habit from every which way that's worthy of looking at as an examination or an expose. What about the concept of habit when it comes to supplements and utilizing supplements? And I thought about something. Oftentimes in the health industry, especially our clients, they think the word supplement is a synonym for fix. And I've often been asked, what do I take for this? What do I take for that? And I think it's really important for us to be reminded, and also to understand, to communicate to our clients, the supplement doesn't fix you. Just as a drug doesn't resolve a disease, neither does a supplement. If someone's experiencing some sort of symptom, so this woman on the left, her stomach seems to be spewing something quite nasty and green, making her feel not so good, she's experiencing some sort of imbalance or a symptom. And we as natural health professionals will give this person a specific supplement. And hopefully, if that supplement was the right choice, that person's symptoms will either alleviate to a greater degree, or if you get really lucky, they'll go away right away. So the supplement in and of itself provides the signal. We can look at that as the input. And in many cases, these supplement signals have to be experienced by the body in the habitual context. And the idea of that is asking the question: if someone has a long-standing dysbiosis, does one Theralac Pro take away their gut problems forever? Well, of course not, because there is a saturation point, if that is even the right choice for the person. So the framework I always think about when I'm making a choice as to what supplement to use, or even explaining to a client why I'm choosing what I did, is the supplement isn't the fix for the ailment. Rather, it provides this consistent input into the body. So the body takes the information biochemically that the supplement will stimulate as a result of swallowing it. And it will help the body activate its self-healing mechanisms. So the output, i.e. the experience of the person, is the restoration of health. And I really hope that resonated with people in terms of a concept, because it reframes how you look at supplements. It's not that all of a sudden a digestive enzyme is automatically fixing someone's digestive issues. It's providing a gap bridge while you habitually give the body that experience so that the digestive issues have a chance to help remedy themselves, and the downstream consequences are not getting worse. They're in fact getting better and potentially alleviating. So the best supplement is often the one that you habitually take. And if that's where a client is, uh, the scope and the detail of your supplement protocol is less important than the nature of the client taking it. The next best supplement is the one that provides the right signal to the body. And I think these are simple truths, but they're so important as reminders about the context and the expectation on the part of the person. So that's what I do when it comes to being able to explain how to supplement for some kind of condition. But I think there's another side to the equation that we may not see. From there, the concept of habitual supplementation is really about maintaining health. And it's not what stops a person from coming to see you. I think it's so important that this reframing come into play, because is health assumed just by getting over your illness? Are you going to be healthy for the rest of your life? Well, no. Unfortunately, our environment, our behaviors, our food, our stresses are trying to take away from our health consciously and unconsciously. So for someone to get out of a crisis state to get into a health state, they have to work just as hard, if not harder, to be there. And I think that's where we as health professionals should come in and actually start to encourage people to think about these things quite differently. So in supplemental philosophy, I think, the only thing that's a true biochemical band-aid, as I call it, is a pharmaceutical. I have a headache, I take a Tylenol, my headache's gone. But it comes back. So we know it's not fixing anything, but it's masking rather. In the world of supplements, we typically don't have these. We have what I call quick win supplements, something that may alleviate the symptoms you feel quite quickly. So, if someone perpetually bloats and you give them a digestive enzyme and you blow their mind, that's a quick win. If someone is highly stressed and you give them 2 or 3 suntheanine and they all of a sudden feel relaxed, that's a quick win, because the efficacious nature of that product acts rather quickly. The best example of a quick win supplements are stimulant-based products. If anyone's ever taken like a pre-workout powder and you feel like you can deadlift 600 pounds all of a sudden, those are the things that people often expect when it comes to what a supplement's going to do. I'm going to take something and I'm supposed to feel it. The reality of the situation is most supplements are what I call long haul, because they take their time to influence the physiology. It's not that the supplement itself is going to give them an effect they feel. Rather, it's going to be 6 months from now when they look in the rear view and they realize that a lot of their symptoms have alleviated because of the habitual nature of taking their supplements. That's the aha moment. The hard part is because they live in their bodies every day, and this is typically a very progressive but gradual process, their ability to be mindful of it is the same kind of example. So when someone loses 15 pounds, they see themselves every day. But if they haven't seen a friend in 3 months, the friend goes, "Oh my God, you've lost so much weight." They go, "I have?" It's like, well, perspective is really everything. So when it comes to supplemental philosophy, the consistency of use is really what actually activates and allows the change. So there's an in-between ground too. Within that, quick win products can also have collateral long haul effects. And let's use a little case study here. So someone has perpetual bloating, abdominal distension, and gas after big meals. What's their concern? Their concern isn't for the microbiome. Their concern isn't necessarily for the biochemical reasons that we're thinking it's concerning. They just don't want to be uncomfortable after they eat. Maybe they go out and they're wearing, a nice new pair of pants and they have a new belt, but after they eat, they feel the pressure of their stomach pushing on the belt, and they have to hold in their stomachs artificially all the time to hide it. And then in addition to that, if they're holding their stomachs in, they're not engaging their parasympathetic nervous system, and their diaphragm's not expanding when they're breathing. So they're actually wiring in a stress response to their bodies as a result of them trying to hide what is something publicly embarrassing. So that's not a good thing. So what's going on here? We have digestive dysfunction. We have implications for the gut and the microbiome, because If you're bloating after you eat, not only does it mean you're not breaking your food down properly, well, likely, it also means there's probably some things living in your upper and lower GI tract that are also reacting to the process of eating. In addition to that, we have the altered breathing rhythm, as I mentioned, and if we downregulate parasympathetic function, does that help or hinder our digestive process if it happens habitually every time we do it? Back to that concept of habit. So their concern is like, just get rid of my bloating and my issues. And what I would do is I would reach for a digestive enzyme. I would potentially give them something like an enzylase or a Digeszyme Plus. And if that Digeszyme Plus or that enzylase was able to provide what their stomach, their gallbladder, their pancreas wasn't making, and they have somewhat of a reduction in that initial bloat, that's a quick win. Over the course of time, if every time they eat, they don't have the negative response, it allows the body to potentially heal the bloating, the parasympathetic dysfunction, maybe work on some of that dysbiosis naturally because you're going to have the proper amounts of acid, the proper amounts of bile going into the small intestine, the proper amounts of pancreatic enzymes being released. And as a result of doing so, you've broken their cycle. So if you've had that problem, this bloating abdominal distension for a period of time, let's call it X number of months, that's become their normal physiology. To expect anything less would be actually quite weird. And as a clinician, we're trying to do with our quick win supplementation is we're trying to rewrite what I'm calling the physiology code. So if consistently that enzyme alleviates the bloat, we're breaking the cycle and we're not allowing what is currently driving and sustaining the symptoms to become even more ingrained and stronger. So therefore, quick win supplements, when used habitually, can also alleviate long-term problems because of the nature of how they intervene with the body. And I believe this is a very important thing for a client to understand because the what is take the pill, the why is actually telling them the reason for your suggestions and what it may be doing to them. And here's an important perspective that I'm often thinking about. Is illness a habit? And I don't mean a conscious habit. I don't mean a mental habit. Is it the body's habit? Is it the evolved process of the path from an imbalance to symptom, from symptom to pathology, from pathology to disease? Because the body doesn't make a mistake. When we have a diagnosis of something, the body doesn't just jump up one day and say, well, I feel like being diabetic today. It's the best possible solution for the series of compromises that the body's trying to manage. And they are physical compromises rooted in habits, mental, emotional, and potentially environmental, which is going to be next month's talk. So I think that's going to be really interesting to kind of marry some of these concepts with understanding how our environment around us influences the things that go on both in our external worlds, but also inside of us. And here's a long haul perspective that I had a really fun time talking about last week. So the concept of inflammation is a very, very nuanced and detailed thing because inflammation is not one thing, nor is it entirely positive or negative. It's contextual. And I wish I could ask someone this question, but I'll ask it anyway, just kind of like hypothetically. If we take sulforaphane, how long does that sulforaphane take to influence an inflammatory response? How long does it take to elicit some kind of experiential changes in someone? Because fundamentally, this is where we have to pair our understanding of biochemical mechanisms of action, our expectation of what we're delivering to a client, and then leave space for, if their habits are good, how their physiology is going to reorganize itself based upon all of the things that we're helping them with. It's kind of like the perfect storm, if you will. Because mechanistically speaking, sulforazyme or sulforaphane and sulforazyme, of course, doesn't directly, neutralize inflammation the way a bucket of water will put out a fire. Rather, what it does is it binds with a very specific factor called KEAP1 to disassociate the NRF2, so that NRF2 phosphorylates itself, travels to the nucleus of a cell, and it stimulates a change in epigenetic transcription factors. It's a very fancy way of saying it sends a very strong message to the cell to start the process of upregulating antioxidant and phase 2 detox enzymes. It doesn't go, oh, there's a fire, let me throw over a fire blanket. That's kind of a nice metaphor in a story. What sulforozyme or sulforaphane does ultimately is it sends a message to the body until the body can grab that message, downregulate the inflammatory response, because if the body's inflamed and perpetually so, it will get better at raising inflammation because that's the signal that's being received. The sulforaphane counter-regulates that. So if you have an adult and a kid on a teeter-totter, if they switch spots, the teeter-totter is going to flip to the other side. And as a result, you're going to experience the benefits of increasing that antioxidant response. But what would that be? Well, that would be potentially an increased level of energy, better mood, lower body composition in terms of accumulation of body fat, less aches and pains, enhanced cognitive function, better performance in the gym. So we still don't know what we're looking for. And if someone is dealing with some kind of chronic autoimmune case that's very well defined, it could be the alleviation of a flare-up of where they experience their symptoms. But this may take place over the course of 1 month for a young, fairly healthy person. But if you're dealing with someone who's 65 years old and they're in their fourth decade of dealing with a chronic inflammatory disease like cardiovascular disease, it may take quite some time for the body's long haul absorption perspectives to be able to overwhelm all the conditions that created that imbalance in the first place. And this is why we created the master philosophy. I didn't feel guided or called to talk about a single product today. I wanted to bring it back to the concept of tying habit to the perspectives of how to look at something in the context of client care. Because on the left-hand side, phase 1A and 1B, you may get some quick wins with the right people. You give someone a digestive enzyme and a probiotic and a little bit of fiber, you can change their life if they're, mildly symptomatic. But if you got some long haul stuff, you have people who, as I said, are in their fourth decade of dealing with a chronic inflammatory degenerative condition, it may take a pretty well formulated concoction of systemic enzymes, antioxidant enzymes, immune modulators, in addition to using the digestive enzyme, the probiotic, and the fiber. And this is really why I call these the tools of the art and science of client care. Understanding that, habit in my world when designing this totally gave me a newfound appreciation for the process, not the specific details of the process, but the process itself. And that's why the philosophy is designed as it is. It's like, go down the least effective route. If that didn't work, try one level up and keep going. And I'll be honest, there are things that you may have to do in addition to using the Master Supplements US Enzymes product portfolio. Fundamentally, it's about whatever helps the client get better. And this is also, inclusive of everyone here, because it's relevant because our physiology, our current state, plus the input signals, the various supplemental interventions, ultimately yields the outcome, the change in physiology. That's the formula. And it's not that, oh, I took Theralac Pro and it fixed my gut. It's like, well, that's kind of a half truth, but the fix is contextual to how it actually worked in the body. So this is really what we actually do as supplements as practitioners. We're solving puzzles and creating formulas that essentially postulate the answer to various equations. And the equation is the conundrum that the client walks into with your office with. And it's not just about their physical health. It's about who they are, their emotions, their habits. And hopefully you're seeing this from a newfound perspective, like shining light through a prism. You're examining the red that comes out on the other side as one factor, the orange, the green, the yellow. So, for this to work, the products have to be beneficial. They have to be high quality and efficacious. Practitioners have to be skilled. Well, that's a foregone conclusion because we have the best practitioners there are. And habits need to be used in an evolutionary manner. So this way we're not, we're not the person who signs up every January at the gym for New Year's resolution, who's been doing so for the last 15 years. And I think, in the context of the bigger picture, these concepts of habits, I think they really help bring awareness to not only maybe some aspects of client care that have become habitually less important in your own right, because you may be focused on the details of learning about dysbiosis in the gut-brain axis, but you have to understand how to apply that information to a human with a name and a personality and a way of looking at the world. And, this approach helps us assess the blocks, but potentially introduce the solution at the same time. What I mean by that is if we talk to our clients about habits and we understand how they were formed, when we see that side of it, but we also potentially see the solution, the fix at the other time, it allows the client to get an insight, a download of going, okay, so now that I see it from all angles, I really know what it is and I know what it is I have to do. Then it's a question, are they ready? And the habits within the choices of daily life ultimately dictate your reality. And that's the client communication strategy 101. If someone's walking in with a boo-boo and they're asking you to put the band-aid on it and they keep creating the boo-boo, it's not how it's going to work. You're helping them solve a riddle and a problem. They're doing the work through you. And I think that's a really important thing. And the personal congruency side of it is, as a health professional, this is what I always challenge other people with, is like, what are some of your habits that may be misaligned or needing improvement? Are we finding ourselves giving advice as sound bites that are things that are conserved in the industry or that we heard at a conference, but we don't necessarily practice ourselves? So I believe that our existence all stems from who we are. All that you do extends out from you, and it's a mirror analogy. When you're looking at things outside of yourself, I do believe what you're looking at is a mirror of the world inside. So when you do look in the mirror, who do you see and what do you see? And I just want to leave you with a final thought, examine your client portfolio and maybe look at how these people are all extensions of you. And not only are you teaching them, but they can teach you things as well. So with that, everyone, we have come to the end of fitness factor number 6, habits and changes ahead. I hope this was something that was interesting, very detailed, and hopefully helpful in a more bigger picture client specific context. And with that, I will stop the screen share.